Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Hybris by the band Änglagård.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So in the past and recently, I've seen many reviews of this album over on YouTube. Well, I wouldn't say many, but a few reviews of this album on YouTube, and it seems like every single person is pronouncing the band's name as Änglagård. Now, I've checked and I've done my research. I can't say for 100%, but I'm pretty sure that the right way to pronounce it is Änglagård. Now, it sounds really odd and I'm gonna probably say it wrong a few times in this video, but as it stands, I really want to be correct on this because last time I tried to pronounce something from Swedish, I got it completely wrong. Anyway, here are some of my favorite bits, and there are a lot from this album. So the year is 1991. Funk, pop, punk, and all kinds of other different things have basically thrown progressive rock to the sidelines of music by now. What's left of the progressive scene is now mostly dominated by metal and extreme metal albums, such as the #1 album for 1991, which is Human by the band Death, which is definitely a far cry from the prog back in the 70s. But little did anyone know, a small group of Swedish teenagers were forming a new band called Änglagård, and these guys, well, they had one mission in mind, and that's to bring back the magnificence that was 70s progressive rock. So just note to self that the guys in this band, some of them were as young as 17 years of age and the oldest one was 25, meaning that they were very young in the early 70s, and some of them were actually even non-existent back then, yet they wanted to recreate just the sound of those years. And this band, consisting of 6 members, was marking what was always bound to come, and that is the next generation of prog. These young Swedish teenagers, which grew up on albums like Close to the Edge or Foxtrot or In the Court of the Crimson King, were all wanting to create something like that, and seeing the state at the time in the albums which were being produced by the big greats of the 70s, yes, I'm talking about you, yes, they wanted to do something different, something new that wasn't done in a long time, and that's to make prog great again.
We will make
prog
great again.
And their approach to creating their 70s-esque album was pretty straightforward. Use only analog instruments, or at least keyboards, and have the electric guitar, the bass, whatever was found, but don't use anything that was created after that time in order to actually sound authentic. Also throw in a crap ton of mellotron and flute just for the sake of nostalgia, and create very long and mostly instrumental pieces. And you know what? It actually fucking worked. Now, I think that so far in the 200 plus episodes I've been doing on this series, I've managed to convey my personal love of prog to you and what I personally really like about it. You all know I really like symphonic prog and everything that is eclectic, and I also have a very strong fondness to everything that came out of Sweden. Thus, of course, in the long run, many of you guys have recommended me this album, and I was highly anticipating getting to hear it because I was sure that your recommendations were very much justified. And now that we've gotten to this album, I can finally say that this was probably the most well anticipated album by the viewers of 365 Days of Prog, and you know what guys, you were definitely correct. So instead I'm gonna relay with all of you my general experience of each and every song and how I perceived it. So starting off with song number 1, which is called Earth Smoke, which is of course a translation because I don't seek to embarrass myself anymore. This first track of course has the most difficult track of any track on any album, which is of course to sell this album to any unsuspecting listeners. This is the first track of their debut. Nobody knows who Änglagård are. They are an obscure band which just released their first debut album, and they're doing something out of the ordinary which wasn't done in a long while, yet people don't know that, and this first song has to prove to anyone that comes across this one that this is the real deal. So acting as some sort of a comeback song, Earth Smoke does its job just brilliantly. And what is immediately obvious about this one is that Änglagård really like their keyboards, right from the starting mysterious piano solo to the mid section with the towering church organ taken right off of an album like Close to the Edge. It is definitely amazing, and everything that is between is very nice as well. You've got the Mellotron, which features itself on the rest of this album and is definitely one of the leading instruments, as well as so many other keyboards being used on here, all with their unique touches of their sound. But of course it doesn't end here, because every single instrument found on this album is definitely top notch. But as I said, I wouldn't be dissecting this album song by song, bit by bit. Instead, I will say that every single instrument to be found on here is just stellar, and I would have gladly listened to any of the instruments found on here in their soloed out form just by themselves, because they are being played and utilized in such amazing ways. But with that being said, it doesn't mean that instruments on here are basically omnipresent, being on there all the time, but instead I believe that this band were able to master the element of restraint. Instead of putting all the instruments at the forefront at all given times, they instead know how to draw back certain instruments in order to let their comebacks be more impactful. You can see that a lot being used with the flute, for instance, that always exists on this album but is not overutilized, and thus making its sections very special. The same goes for the drums. They're very heavy, they're very harsh, they're very great, they're never monotonous, they're so creative, and in a lot of sections in this album they are taken aback a bit in order for their heavier and more rougher parts to be more impactful on the listener. And of course, much like the last point, this also carries out to the rest of the instruments. Those are just a few examples that I could point out. Now, needless to say, Earth Smoke is just a perfect track, and it smoothly just transitions into the next track called Wanderings in Confusion. And this next song really cemented the idea with me that this album and the music found on it just wasn't made by actual humans. Wait, Naomi, what do you mean not made by humans? Oh, okay, yeah, I guess an explanation is due. So, you know how you have a book like the Bible, for instance? It's basically a perfect book. It is undoubtedly the master of all books that exist, yet nobody really knows who wrote it, or even if it was a singular person or a group of people. There's really not a definitive answer. But at the end of the day, that book, the Bible, it's here, it's existing, it has actual written words in it, and it's basically flawless. And well, this album kind of feels like that to me. It doesn't feel like an album that was written by any sort of individual or a group of individuals, because the music on here is just so freaking perfect in some way. It transcends, normal music creation, at least in my opinion. Maybe I'm going a bit far with this, but I just can't fathom to myself how anyone could come up with music like this and execute it so flawlessly. Okay, let's not get anti-theistic over here. Okay, I'm not comparing Hybris to the Bible. I'm just thinking that they have some sort of similarities within their method of creation in some way. I don't know what I'm getting at. I hope I got my point across, because if I didn't, I'm probably gonna have a few people unsubscribing right now. The next track is called From Clarity to Clarity, and this one is also a definitive banger. It starts off with this very interesting musical box, and it has an effect that makes you think that your headphones are basically broken or malfunctioning, but surprise surprise, they aren't. It's just the album itself, and then the album does the most reasonable thing it can do ever, and it fucking jump scares the listener. So for anyone who actually knows this song, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and for anyone who doesn't, I'm sorry that I ruined the surprise for you, but at the same time, you're gonna thank me. And even now, knowing that this entrance of the entire ensemble after this musical box section is definitely very frightening, I still, when I come to it, at least miss one heartbeat, because it is definitely very much surprising. And of course, the rest of this song is definitely godlike, and it makes use of the flute, I think, the most out of any song in this album, which is something that I definitely embraced. But I think that this is the point where I should mention what I should have mentioned earlier, and that's the fact that despite this album putting some very clear borders between the 4 songs of it, it is still very much a seamless and smooth flowing album. I couldn't tell you at this time and day, if I heard like a sample from one of the songs, which song does it actually belong to, because most of this album does sound quite similar to itself. But with that being said, it doesn't mean that the album is monotonous or repetitive. You just really can't tell, because it is so dynamic, so ever shifting, and so changing that it just kind of sounds similar, but again, each and every time it sounds very much unique. And I think that the best allegory to actually what this album really sounds like is thinking about a Rubik's Cube. So a Rubik's Cube has 6 sides, and each side has its own color, and much like that, this band also has the 6 players, and all of the players have their own instruments in which they play. Now, the thing is, a Rubik's Cube can be scrambled in so many different ways to form a different variation of the same cube, and that's a lot like what this album actually feels like. It feels like it uses the same 6 colors or the same 6 players with their own unique instruments, but in various different ways on each and every one of the songs, thus basically rendering each song its own original and unique piece of music, which is great because of the sum of its parts. And then we move on to the last track on this album, which arguably has the second most important value for this entire album. This song is of course Winter King, and it is supposed to cap off this album, and in its essence it is supposed to leave you with a very strong impression of what you've just heard. And obviously this song is also a masterpiece of prog. It sounds very much like the 70s prog. It is amazing, it is bombastic, it's the longest one out of all the album, and it definitely leaves a very strong impression. I see a lot of various albums which are pretty good or even great all the way through, but then end off in a very disappointing note, and that's something very unfortunate, which fortunately wasn't done on this album. And all in all, 1991 will always be remembered for Hybris. I know that this year also saw the release of Dream Theater's Images and Words, which is considered to be a very good album, but to me personally, and I think to everyone who really likes original good old sounding symphonic prog, this will be the album that will always define 1992, and even if so, I would have to say that it would define the entire 90s when it comes to the biggest prog masterpieces of that time. But this album's greatness doesn't end here, because it moves on straight right into the album cover, which is also a very much noteworthy cover to mention. The cover for this album is definitely the perfect cover for this piece of music. Much like K.A. by Magma, this one also takes the approach of a very rugged and degraded symbol that is supposed to symbolize a piece of music which is in its essence a masterpiece that was unearthed from the past. Of course, Hybris was not made back in the early 70s, it was made in 1992, but in all aspects it does feel and should be counted and looked at towards one of the greatest 70s projects. prog albums. Well, at least 70s sounding like prog albums. And seeing this cover, I am overwhelmed by it. It takes some slight inspirations from albums like Larkstung's in Aspic or even Trespass by Genesis with the images that it portrays on its cover, but of course it doesn't look fresh and new, but it looks like there has been a while since it was made and it's like a part of the past, a relic of once was, much like the music found on here. I honestly couldn't have thought of a better cover for this one. The music on here is so versatile in so many ways that there really isn't one right way to portray the music in cover form, but I think that the job that was done here was absolutely splendid, and this one is definitely a memorable cover and a very fitting one for this masterpiece of an album. But all of you lovely viewers, you were definitely correct in thinking that I would like this album, and of course like isn't even close to what I actually feel about this album. This album is one that I really love, and thus it will be receiving the finest rating of 10 out of 10. And you know, currently I feel like I'm suffering from some sort of PEAD, which is post-euphoric album disorder, which basically means that I was so overwhelmed by the sheer greatness of this album that I really don't know what to do with it. So the only way I feel like I'm coping with it is by re-listening to it again and again and again, and that's definitely something that I'm gonna do for a while now. But I think I'm gonna have to restrain myself and tell you all that that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Annabelle's by the band Boo Boo. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wallnum and Wrist of Kings. You are the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.